Veteran waitress was shamed for her scar. Then a teen in uniform gave her dignity back. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Midday sunlight poured through the fogged windows of Prairie Junction Diner, stretching across the worn wooden floor like a soft yellow carpet. The scent of fresh-baked pies blended with hot coffee, filling the air with a comforting familiarity you'd expect only in the heart of small-town America. In that space, Helen Granger moved quietly, carrying 3 plates of steaming food, her steps careful but steady, her head slightly bowed to avoid direct stares. At 47, Helen had once lived a different life. On the burning sands of Iraq, where she served as a combat medic, fighting to keep soldiers alive amid explosions and bloodshed. But that was over a decade ago. Now, the long scar trailing from her left temple to her jawline reminded her daily that war never really leaves you. It simply changes shape and setting. She set the food down at table 6, a familiar elderly couple who nodded their thanks out of habit. No one looked at her face longer than a second, not out of discomfort, but because her presence had become part of the rhythm of the place. To them, Helen was no longer the woman with the scar. She was just Helen, the attentive waitress who never let a coffee cup run dry. The diner's door opened. The bell above chimed lightly. 5 sharply dressed men and women stepped inside, their expensive cologne and air of overconfidence clashing with the humble warmth of the diner. Leading them was Brent Walker, his navy suit tailored to the inch, blood-red tie perfectly knotted. Brent was no stranger to attention, and never one to downplay it. Helen nodded to Emma, the hostess, then made her way to the large table the group had taken. "Good afternoon," she said evenly. "I'm Helen. I'll be serving you today. Can I get anyone started with something to drink?" Brent looked up from the menu, his gaze pausing when it landed on her face, as though something didn't belong. His eyes locked on the scar that ran down her cheek, settling near the corner of her mouth like an unfinished stitch. "Good Lord," he muttered just loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Who's this?" Freddy Krueger in retirement. A woman beside him let out a snore of laughter. Helen didn't flinch. She didn't look down. She didn't fire back. She simply shifted 1 step to the right and turned to the next guest. But Brent wasn't finished. "Let's be honest," he said louder. "If I owned this place, I wouldn't have someone like her serving food. Kind of kills your appetite, doesn't it?" For a moment, the entire diner seemed to stop breathing. The clink of silverware stopped. The manager behind the counter looked down at his reservation book. A man in the corner feigned interest in his phone. A young woman paused her typing, but didn't raise her head. Silence. Heavy like the first snowfall. Helen's hand clenched slightly, the familiar sting rising along her scarred cheek. She'd endured worse physical pain, but the public humiliation and the quiet consent surrounding it cut the deepest. "I'll have someone else take care of your table," she said softly, turning to leave, her head held high. "Probably for the best," Brent sneered behind her. "At least the food won't get cold from fear." Laughter. Again. And indifference. Helen walked toward the kitchen, back straight, steps measured. But each step felt like a stone added to her chest. She didn't need praise. She didn't need sympathy. She just wanted to do her job, without being judged for something she couldn't change. As she passed the coffee machine, she caught her reflection in the cloudy glass. Her face, the scar folding slightly at the corner of her mouth, and her eyes, still steady, still calm. She took a long breath, and then she returned to work. At the back of the diner, a young boy in a Riverside Military Academy uniform had watched everything. His face was stern, his eyes dark with anger. His hands gripped the edge of the table, wrestling with the choice between silence and courage. Helen's story wasn't over, and something was about to change. The pin still sat neatly on the left pocket of Helen Granger's uniform. It didn't shine like a military medal, nor did it carry the weight of her past. But to Helen, that small object was proof that a 15-year-old boy had seen her as a human being, where so many adults had seen only a scar. The next morning, Prairie Junction Diner opened like usual. The same old wooden chairs creaked with familiar sounds. The scent of fresh brewed coffee blended with brown butter and warm pies. But the atmosphere had changed. Helen entered through the back, as she always did, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she had to shrink into the background. She moved with the same quiet grace, but not to hide. It was the calm of someone who finally knew exactly who she was. No one said anything, but everyone felt it. When Helen passed by tables, the glances that once looked away now looked up, no longer to judge, but to silently acknowledge. Then something small happened. Small, but to Helen, it felt like a turning point. A girl around 10 years old, blonde hair in 2 braids, was sitting with her grandmother by the window. When Helen placed a hot plate in front of them, the girl looked up and smiled. "I like your pin." Helen paused for a second, then returned the smile, a real one, the first in months, and replied, "I like it too." No long explanations. No talk of war. Just a small moment, where honest admiration wasn't blocked by prejudice, where a scar didn't obscure inner strength. That afternoon, Caleb returned. He wore his Riverside Military Academy uniform and held a small box. When Helen came to his table, he stood, nervous but prepared. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to keep the pin," he said. "At the academy, we only give this when someone truly lives with honor. Yesterday, I was emotional, but today I'm sure." He opened the box. Inside was an official copy of the same pin, this time serialized, engraved with her name. "I had mine reissued. This one is yours to keep." Helen looked at the small item like it was stitching closed a wound from long ago. She pinned it on, right then and there. Not to cover her scar, not to defend anything, but to let it be, a part of her, now and always. A shift in how people looked at her. Word of the cadet who stood up for the scarred waitress began to spread, not through news articles, but by word of mouth. And in small towns, stories travel faster than radio waves. People began visiting the diner not just for coffee or pie. Some came out of curiosity, but many, especially the older folks, came because it awakened something in them they had long buried. One Saturday morning, Charlie McGraw, 76, retired Marine, who usually avoided crowds, walked into the diner. On his chest was a Purple Heart, worn again after years in a wooden box. He sat at the counter, looked up at Helen, and said, "You're the reason I put this back on. I used to think no one wanted to see it anymore." Helen nodded, her expression calm, but inside, she was shaken. Men like Charlie, like her, had been forgotten by the world. But now, recognition was blooming again, from something as small as a conversation. A turning point in the unlikeliest place. A few days later, the diner manager, Lester, the soft-spoken, heavy-set man who rarely said much, called Helen into the office. She expected a chat about shifts or scheduling. Instead, he stood, handed her a sheet of paper. "I don't really know how to do this," he said, but the staff all agreed. "You deserve this." It was a proposal to rename the diner, from Prairie Junction Diner to Valor Diner. The stated reason: to honor not just Helen Granger, but all who have worn the uniform and were never properly thanked. Helen froze. She didn't answer right away. To her, honor wasn't about signs or names. But what caught her breath was the final line on the page. "Everything else stays the same, except how we see each other." She nodded, not for the name, but because she knew people were finally calling the truth by its name. A community reborn. The following week, a new sign went up. Valor Diner, with a V shaped like a soaring eagle, now sat proudly against the weathered wood. Inside, a small wall of honor had been installed, listing the names, photos, and medals of local veterans. Helen's name wasn't at the top, but it was there, 3rd row down, and that was enough. Customers began talking more. Not just small talk, but real questions. "What unit were you with? Were you ever in Fallujah? Do you know a guy named Brad? I think he mentioned a medic like you once." She didn't answer them all, but she listened. And in every eye she met, she saw unspoken recognition. A quiet flame. On Friday night, as the diner wound down, Helen wiped the last table and turned off most of the lights. Caleb stopped by again, this time with a few other cadets. They all bowed their heads slightly when they saw her. One of them, A boy named Marcus, just 14, said softly, "I want to grow up to be like you." Helen didn't respond, but her eyes, bright, unhidden, held the answer. She had once been ignored. Once wore her scar like a sentence. But now, she didn't need to explain anything anymore. The pin on her chest said it all. And in the gentle hush of a quiet diner, Helen Granger, the woman who once quietly passed through others' glances, had become the steady flame lighting the way for those still searching for courage within themselves. The Monday morning at Valor Diner began like any other. The aroma of freshly baked pastries wafted through the air, coffee dripped steadily into a well-worn glass pot, and the doorbell jingled with each customer's arrival. Yet, there was an intangible shift in the atmosphere. A newfound sense of reverence permeated the space. Helen Granger arrived punctually, donning her crisp navy blue uniform and apron. Since pinning the modest badge gifted by a young military cadet to her chest, Helen had transcended her role as a mere waitress. She had become a living testament to a once overlooked truth, the enduring dignity of returning soldiers. The left wall of the diner, previously adorned with dessert advertisements and breakfast specials, had been transformed into the Wall of Honor. A dark wooden plaque bore the inscription in brass letters. Todos vos svet, những người đã không bao giờ lùi bước. Each framed photograph told a unique story. Some depicted sailors in uniform. Others showed beaming smiles beside dusty jeeps. Beneath each photo were concise yet weighty inscriptions. Names, service years, units. Helen's photograph wasn't prominently displayed. She preferred it that way. Her image, clad in a medical blouse against a desert backdrop, hung subtly in the lower right corner, accompanied by the caption, "Combat Medic, Fallujah, 2005. Remarkably, this transformation wasn't the result of a campaign or social media movement. One by one, patrons and local shopkeepers began to change. An elderly man would remove his hat and place it over his heart when passing the Wall of Honor. A young couple would pause to read each inscription, guiding their child to understand the significance of the images. See these people? They helped keep our country safe. Most importantly, people began to ask questions, not out of politeness, but genuine curiosity. Did you serve in Ramadi? My brother was stationed there. Do you know Petty Officer Samuels? I heard a female medic once saved his life. Helen didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in years, she felt heard, not merely observed. One Friday afternoon, Manager Lester emerged from his office holding a recycled paper notice. First Saturday of every month, veterans gathering at Valor Diner. Free coffee. No explanations needed, just show up. Helen was surprised to see her name at the bottom, labeled as Keeper of the Flame. She hadn't sought the spotlight, but she couldn't deny that her presence had rekindled something dormant within the community. The inaugural gathering saw 4 attendees. Charlie McGraw, a Marine Corps veteran, an elderly woman who once served as a World War II telegraph operator, a truck driver who had been in Bosnia, and a young man recently discharged, still adjusting to civilian life. Helen didn't speak much. She poured coffee and listened to fragmented stories filled with both sorrow and pride. She wasn't a speaker. She was the keeper of the flame, the embodiment of presence and respect. Word of these gatherings spread rapidly. By the 3rd month, extra tables were needed. Attendees brought mementos, old photographs, metal fragments, poems, and scars. They didn't need grand gestures, just the comfort of shared company and the assurance they weren't alone. Regular patrons began to change as well. Avoiding glances turned into understanding looks. Expressions of gratitude became heartfelt. A young boy once asked his mother, "Mom, why does everyone like the lady with the scar?" She replied, "Because she stayed when others left. She never let anyone be forgotten." One morning, as Helen cleaned tables, a well-dressed man entered. His face was familiar. Upon removing his hat, everyone recognized Brent Walker. Silence enveloped the diner. He approached his old table, the one from which he had once uttered hurtful words, and stood quietly. Helen passed by, their eyes meeting. There was no animosity, no avoidance, just a steady, unshaken gaze. Brent placed a small envelope on the table. For the Valor Veterans Fund. I'm not seeking forgiveness. I just realized I was wrong. He left without fanfare. No applause followed, but in that moment, a door opened, allowing light to enter. The community surrounding Valor Diner began to awaken, not through slogans or speeches, but through everyday acts of kindness. A local garage started offering discounts to veterans. Schools organized veterans memory sessions, inviting Helen to share her experiences. The local church pastor invited her to a memorial service, not to speak, but to stand in solidarity with the community. Kindness is never too late, and when respect is rightfully acknowledged, it has the power to transform an entire community. From a modest diner, a once-forgotten soldier inspired those around her to reflect, stand up, listen, respect, and heal. Helen wasn't a hero in the traditional sense, but she exemplified that honor isn't rooted in the past. It's found in how we live today. As autumn arrived, the maple leaves painted the small street corner where Valor Diner stood in shades of red. The scent of burning wood from the fireplace mingled with the aroma of freshly roasted coffee, drifting through the slightly open window. In this slow-paced atmosphere, Helen Granger felt she was no longer on the sidelines, but a peaceful part of a rejuvenating flow. That morning, she received a letter bearing the seal of Riverside Military Academy, the school where Caleb Turner studied. It wasn't an announcement or promotional material, just a handwritten note from the headmaster in slanted handwriting. We're not inviting you to speak about war. We are inviting you to teach our cadets what it means to live with honor. Helen held the letter for a long time. In her life, she had entered makeshift operating rooms under the sound of gunfire, but never had she felt as heavy-hearted as when faced with recounting past events, not to adults, but to young individuals learning to become soldiers. The talk was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. On the small wooden stage in Riverside's auditorium, Helen wore her old, neatly pressed uniform. The scar on her cheek was unhidden. She no longer needed to conceal it. In front of her sat nearly 100 cadets, from youthful faces to eyes beginning to reflect discipline and readiness. Helen didn't start with a formal greeting. She simply stood there, looked at the cadets sitting upright, and spoke in a low, measured voice. I'm not here to tell you what I've lost. I'm here to talk about what I've kept. That's honor. Not the kind that comes from medals, but the kind you earn when you choose to love, even after knowing what loss feels like. Below, Caleb sat in the front row. He looked at her with pride and gratitude. Not everyone gets the chance to see someone they admire become a true teacher to others. Helen recounted time she pulled a young soldier out of a minefield, even though she was injured herself. She didn't tell it for praise. She told it so the cadets would understand. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite being afraid. When she finished, no one clapped immediately. There was a deep silence, so profound that the ticking of the wall clock was audible. Then a young cadet with brown skin stood up, eyes red, and said, I won't forget what you just taught us, not just on the battlefield, but in life. A few days later, back at Valor Diner, Helen noticed Melissa, a new employee in her early 20s, bright-eyed, with brown hair tied up, still seemed uneasy when serving older customers in uniform. One late afternoon, when the diner was quiet, Helen poured her a cup of hot cocoa and sat at a corner table. She didn't scold or lecture, just asked, Do you know anyone who served in the military? Melissa shook her head. I just know they often don't talk much and seem sad. I don't know how to start a conversation. Helen nodded. Actually, you don't need to say much. Just look at them as a person. Someone who survived, but carries unseen memories. Respect starts with your eyes, not your words. From that day, Melissa changed. She learned to nod when meeting veterans. She remembered the names of regular attendees at the gatherings. And once, she bowed to a deaf veteran using sign language, a language she had never learned before. But she researched it to make that gesture. Helen just watched and smiled. The flame had been passed on. November arrived, bringing farewell ceremonies for Riverside cadets preparing to graduate and be discharged. A small group came to Valor Diner for their last meal before leaving school. Among them was a slender boy with a high and tight haircut named Isaac, who didn't talk much. He sat at the back of the diner, holding a cup of coffee he didn't drink. When Helen approached, he stood up, awkwardly asked, "Do you have any advice for someone about to wear the uniform?" Helen didn't answer immediately. She sat across from him, looked at him for a long time. She took a small badge from her pocket, not a rank insignia, but a piece of old cloth, once part of a bandage used on a battlefield. "Out there," she said, "sometimes you'll feel ignored, misunderstood, or even mocked. But never let others decide your worth. Honor doesn't need validation. It lives in how you rise each day." She folded the cloth, placed it in his hand like a ritual of passing the torch. "Keep this, not to carry around, but to remember that someone before you believed in you." Helen had no children, no husband. Her family was scattered. Many had passed away. But whenever she sat alone at the back corner table of the diner, where the afternoon sun streamed diagonally through the window, she knew she was no longer alone. The young people passing through her life were like small flashlights in the dark, but she was the one who lit the flame for them, so they could find their way. And that's what turned someone once forgotten into a guide. Quietly, humanely, like a candle silently lighting the next torch. Helen didn't need a stage, didn't need a microphone. Just a glance, a timely word, a small piece of cloth placed in a hand, to pass on the value of life without needing praise. On the first winter afternoon, shadows stretched across the tiled roof of Valor Diner as bare trees etched. Simple silhouettes against a pale gray sky. The season's first snowflakes hovered in the air, not yet settling, bringing a chill that made passers-by slow their steps. Inside the diner, warmth prevailed, not just from the gentle heat of the fireplace, but from an intangible sense of peace in a place that had known pain and learned to heal. Helen Granger, the woman bearing the scars of war, sat at her usual corner table near the window, a cup of peppermint tea in hand, watching children play in the snow. Though she had retired the previous month after 11 years of unwavering service, she returned each morning. That day, as Helen settled in, a group of workers entered with toolboxes, greeting Lester, the manager, before approaching her table. One pointed to the wooden wall behind her seat, asking, "Right here, were you marked?" Lester nodded. Exactly. This was always her spot. Before Helen could inquire, Lester gently moved her chair aside and placed a small brass plaque on the table. Its polished surface bore the inscription, "For the one who never backed down, Helen Granger, Combat Medic, Fallujah, 2005. In that moment, the diner fell silent. No clinking utensils, no murmured conversations. Only the collective gaze of everyone present turned toward her. Helen touched the edge of the plaque, feeling the cool metal, a tangible connection to memories she had carried silently for years. Not for recognition, but to ensure others never felt invisible. Later that afternoon, an elderly man with a slight limp entered, carrying a small wooden box. Helen recognized him instantly. Sergeant Patrick Doyle, a veteran who had once frequented the diner but had been absent for years. He approached her table, opened the box to reveal a gleaming silver star, and said softly, "I used to hide this because I couldn't face the questions I couldn't answer." Looking directly at Helen, he continued, "But seeing you embrace your scars, your pain, and your courage, maybe it's time I try to." Helen responded by gently pushing the box back toward him, a silent gesture encouraging him to reclaim what was rightfully his, in the light this time. Soon after, a group of high school students visited the diner, prompted by their history teacher. They came not for the food, but to meet the woman with a scar on her face who always smiles with her eyes. One shy girl named Lila asked, "Were you scared when you got hurt?" Helen paused, then met her gaze. "Yes, I was afraid of pain, of loss, of not coming back. But the one thing I never feared was living kindly afterward." Her words weren't meant as a lesson, but as a passing of the torch, a reminder that understanding war also means understanding compassion. A week later, during the regular veterans gathering, Helen noticed an empty chair beside the honor table. On it rested a small wooden sign, For those on their way back, we will always wait. When she asked Lester about it, he smiled. Not everyone is ready to sit here immediately, but when they are, the seat is waiting. Helen contemplated the chair, a place for those not yet ready, but never forgotten. A silent message that no one is left behind. On a foggy morning, Helen arrived earlier than usual, carrying a small wooden box containing the badge Caleb had once given her, carefully preserved. She handed it to Lester. "Keep this for me. Not because I don't need it anymore, but because someone else might need it more now." She took her usual seat, sipping peppermint tea. There was a lightness in her posture, as if she had set down a burden carried for years. Quiet yet powerful. No applause, no speeches. Just a small brass plaque, an empty chair awaiting someone's return, and a woman whose scarred face no longer needed medals or titles, because she was remembered for something far greater, her spirit. Honor isn't about appearances or accolades. It's found in how we rise, confront challenges, and ensure no one is ever left behind. Honor is never outdated. A lesson from Helen Granger for life today. The story of Helen Granger is more than a quiet hero's tale of a former combat medic. It's a mirror reflecting the challenges of our modern society. Indifference, prejudice, and the frightening silence that occurs when people witness injustice but fail to act. In a world too busy to truly listen and too quick to judge what's on the surface, Helen, with the long scar across her face and the gentleness in her eyes, stands as a symbol of what true honor, courage, and resilience really mean. Today, not all of us have faced war. But who among us hasn't been wounded by judgment? Who hasn't been overlooked because of our past, our circumstances, or our appearance? Helen's story reminds us that everyone carries scars, not always on the skin, but often deep within the soul. And what we need, sometimes, isn't healing through words, but rather a gaze that doesn't look away, a presence that truly sees us, or a small gesture that quietly says, "I see you. You deserve respect." In a world increasingly divided by generational, cultural, and political differences, the brass plaque that marks Helen's seat, engraved with the words "For the one who never backed down," is a subtle but powerful reminder. Kindness is never too late, and courage is never out of style. You don't have to be a veteran to deserve honor. Anyone who stands up for human dignity, whether it's a 15-year-old cadet or a scarred waitress who refuses to shrink from the world, becomes a small torch that lights the way for others. Applied to our daily lives, this lesson begins with simple acts. Not turning away when someone is being bullied, taking the time to listen to the elderly even if their words come slowly, or teaching our children that heroes don't only exist on movie screens. Sometimes they're the quiet ones right in front of us, standing strong and refusing to leave anyone behind. Because, as Helen lived and reminded an entire community, honor isn't in grand displays. It lives in the way we choose to love, the moments we choose to rise, and in the promise we make, with our presence, our words, or even just our eyes, to never leave anyone unseen. Thank you so much for being here. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more heartfelt stories soon. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one.